Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I just love this cemetery, don't you? Don't you just love it? A Victorian garden cemetery right here in Placerville. You know, some of the girls I knew growing up thought that Placerville was a podunk town. Well, not me. I knew we had class. We had art. We had style, and we had a Victorian garden cemetery. And I always knew that one day I would be buried here. And somehow that was comforting. I'm Lulu Weatherwax, and I was born just as the gold rush had ended. I heard a lot about that growing up, but mostly I was surrounded by people who had decided to stick it out despite the gold running out. I lived in a house just down the road from here. I lived there my whole life. Oh, I never married. I guess you could say I just never met the right man. At least that's how my mother would tell it. But truth is, I just was never really interested. I even thought there might be something wrong with me. But hearing my friends swooning over this strapping young man or that when they were adolescents, it just never did anything for me. No, I preferred my art. And as time went on, I had some lifelong friends. But most of my contemporaries married and distanced themselves from the single women that they knew, myself included. It was okay. Soon they started having children, and I was even less interested in that. No, I liked my art, and I liked people who liked art. I made a modest living, but it was never enough to move out, so I made a studio for myself in my parents' home. I had won my first accolade at the tender age of 14 when I entered one of my pieces in the El Dorado County Fair and won in several categories. Right then, that's when I knew for sure I was an artist. Nothing else mattered. I painted on canvas, sure, but my true love was painting ceramic. I found some kind of peace, painting on a delicate piece of ceramic and knowing that my paint through fire would become permanent, that this plain white plate would forever be endowed with my imagination. I found others like me, gravitated toward others like me, the art lovers, the poets, the musicians, and they gravitated toward me too. My father was a decent man. He owned a hardware store down on Main Street and was a fairly well-respected businessman and member of the community. He even had some mining interests in what little was left of the gold. He was a member of several fraternal organizations, which is how he spent most of his time, especially in his later years. He served as Placerville city clerk for a long time. He was a quiet man, at least around me. I don't think he ever really knew how to think about me. I mean, in his mind, a girl grew up, got married, made a family of her own. That's not what I did. But he was a good man and a kind father. I think that my mother knew from early on that I would find no solace in a standard life. Oh, she bemoaned her lack of grandchildren, certainly, but for the most part, she supported me in my passions, in my lifestyle. I never felt rejected or that I was a disappointment to either of them. They were good, loving parents, and they loved their daughter, even in her eccentricities. As I had mentioned, I built a studio in our home. Oh, it was a large enough house. I think that they had really expected to have more children, but they were fixed with me. And so I took more than my fair share of the room and made a place for myself. And soon, those people that I had mentioned before, the artists and the poets and the musicians, they gravitated toward my studio too. I tried being what I was supposed to be. I tried holding down a regular job or two. I was a secretary for a while, but it just never stuck. I managed to make some money with my art, but just not enough to live on my own. And besides, I liked it with my parents. And I had my studio. And the beach house, Moss Beach. Well, I was part owner with some friends. And I would go down there in the summertime just to get away for a bit. But for the most part, I spent most of my time in my studio. I spent my life there, really, creating art and living a life not expected. With some encouragement, I even entered my work in the Pan-Pacific Exposition of 1915 in San Francisco, and I won. I added that to my ever-growing collection of ribbons that my art had won. You would think that with this many ribbons, I would have made more money at it. Well, I had the ribbons. Then 3 years after that, my father passed. Then it was just me and my mother. Tables had turned. Now I was taking care of her. She lived a long and happy life and finally passed at the age of 88. Then it was just me. Something had changed. My art did not inspire me as much as it had before. My life was not as eccentric as it used to be. Oh, I had my cousin Myrtle who lived in Berkeley, and I would go visit her, and we'd meet in San Francisco on the weekends. And then, about 6 or 7 years after my mother passed on, 1945, in fact, I decided that there was nothing left for me in Placerville. Oh, it would always be my home. But I needed to experience something different before I died. And besides, I knew that I would always come back here someday to this beautiful garden cemetery. But at that time, there were bohemians in San Francisco. And even though I was an old woman, they accepted me. So I had some final adventures, fairly carefree for about 5 years. And then when I passed on, they brought me back here to Placerville and laid me to rest. Right here, where I always knew I would return. It's lovely, isn't it? Thank you so much for coming today and listening to my story.